and listened. I don't hear anything. Fingers on your light switches? Floor's quiet voice hummed with tension. Now! Our lights blew up in the darkness at the same time. And there they were, the frigging gargoyles from upstairs. With the sound of grinding stone, their heads swiveled toward us. Explosions from Floor's rifle obliterated the rest of my mind-blown expletive. Sparks flew from the charging monstrosities and bullets caromed, one whining past my head. But I couldn't move. Spread out, Floor called. With the gargoyles almost on top of us, something kick-started in my brain. I took off to the left, weaving around pillars, my headlamp jostling madly. Okay, this makes no sense. No flipping sense whatsoever. When I turned to check on the others, one of the gargoyles rose over me. I threw myself from the path of its descending fist and landed in an awkward roll, clunking several times over my backpack. The gargoyle's fist cracked into stone behind me, shaking the library's foundation. Perhaps for my academic background, I had a bad habit of trying to make sense of situations that required a pure fight-or-flight response. But as I scrabbled to my feet, I couldn't keep my mind from connecting the curtain of energy in the vault to the cursed warning to the bludgeoned looters. Had our presence downstairs triggered some sort of an alarm? One that had animated the gargoyles? I had seen some strange stuff in Grandpa's study, but this was taking it to a whole new level. I stumbled backwards, my light swimming over the advancing gargoyle. Beyond the creature, Floor's and James's lights lashed around. Rifle bursts collided with shouting, but I couldn't tell how they were faring. Something rammed my back hard enough to rattle my teeth. I pawed to both sides to find I had not only backed into a wall, but a corner. The gargoyle stalked toward me, spreading its arms to prevent my escape. "Hey, can we talk about this?" I stammered. The gargoyle reached down and grasped my head like a basketball. The crushing pressure registered as red lights behind my eyes. I didn't know what kind of pounds per square inch we were talking, but it had to be testing my skull's limits. Grasping the gargoyle's wrist in both hands, I pulled myself up and kicked. Its stone stomach stopped my heel cold. The gargoyle responded with a knee that collapsed my own belly. Then it flung me away. I wrapped my head with my arms, sure I was going to splat into a pillar. Instead, I hit the ground pack first and flopped onto my stomach. I lay stunned, unable to move, breathe. The rifle bursts had stopped, and I couldn't hear Floor or James. Just the gargoyle, its stone steps cracking toward me. "You're not exciting enough," my last girlfriend had said. "All you ever do is read," she'd said. I winced and raised my face, the weak headlamp finding the creature's knees. Beyond, I glimpsed one of the battered and dried-out corpses on the steps. God, I didn't want to end up like those guys. I lifted my light to the gargoyle's horned snout and narrow, chiseled eyes. I didn't suppose it would do any good to explain I was a researcher and not a looter. The gargoyle arrived in front of me and drew back a leg. "Hey," I rasped, holding an arm out. "Easy there." Its stone lips trembled from snarling teeth. I curled into a ball, anticipating the impact of the organ-crushing kick. Only it didn't arrive. After another second, I peeked between my forearms. The gargoyle was frozen in place, balanced on one leg. Then, very slowly, it began to tip to the side. Its eventual collision with the floor snapped an arm at the elbow and shattered both fangs. I scrambled to my feet, expecting the gargoyle to rise again, to resume its attack. But whatever force had possessed it moments before seemed to have broken apart like the statue. "Well," James said, appearing from behind a pillar. "Maybe not as skilled a toss as your cowboys, but it seems I lassoed the bugger all the same." I had no idea what he was talking about until he crouched and fingered something around the gargoyle's neck. I took a tentative step closer. "What is that?" "A rock salt necklace," he replied. "Before you arrived in town, a villager talked Flor and me into buying a pair. Claimed it would dispel evil magic. They didn't seem to be doing much in our packs, so I got the idea to throw in around his partner over there. I'll be damned if it didn't work. I turned my head to where, across the room, Flor's light illuminated the other gargoyle, also toppled. James clapped my shoulder. Seems I got to yours just in time, too. No kidding, I said. Thanks. The American is okay? Flor asked, striding up to us. I'll live. I coughed weakly, my ribs flaring with pain, and nodded at a spot on her upper arm slick with blood. What about you? She shrugged it off. A bullet graze. I turned to James. And you? Took a slight knock to the head. Nothing a little whiskey can't cure. Good, because we have work to do. Maybe it was pain endorphins, but my various injuries seemed to be having a sedating, focusing effect. Manuscripts or not, it was still crucial we get through the night. 3 things, specifically. Number 1, we need to block the front door. I don't know whether the wolves would try to venture in here, but I don't see why they wouldn't. 2, we need to get those pickaxes Flor saw upstairs and break the gargoyles apart. Whatever the rock salt is doing may not last, and I don't think any of us want a rematch. I glanced up at Flor, who was watching me intently. And 3, a stuffy voice echoed from upstairs. Where in the hell has everyone gone? 3, I repeated. We need to keep an eye on Bertrand. Chapter 11. James volunteered to pickaxe the gargoyles while Flor and I dealt with the front door. Bertrand, who remained convinced the texts were somewhere in the monastery, went limping off with a makeshift torch in search of them. I let him, figuring it would keep him out of the way for the time being. It was the nighttime, when the rest of us would be sleeping, that he concerned me the most. I grunted my way to the top of the stones Flor and I had piled against the timber we'd stood over the entrance. Ribs protesting where the gargoyle had driven its knee, I hefted a chunk of fallen pillar into the final space. I exhaled. There. Flor blew a strand of hair from her eyes and assessed the pile, fists on her hips. Now we use the rest of the timber to brace it. I nodded wearily and climbed back down. Together we stood a scavenged beam on end, wedged it against a fallen pillar set back from the entrance, and then lowered the other end against the piled-up stones at an angle. Opposite me, Flor seemed to be handling the work with relative ease, and I caught myself admiring the slender muscles along her arms. So, I said as we lifted another beam, now that there are no texts, want to tell me what you're doing here? You do not give up, do you? Her voice seemed to carry a flirtatious note of challenge. I peeked past the wooden beam to find the black eyes beneath her thick brows fixed on mine. A small smile teased her lips. On some questions, no, I said. What difference does it make why I am here? Like you say, there are no texts. Maybe I just want to trust you. Far away, a wolf's howl went up. Flor looked from the sound to me, eyebrow cocked. I saved you from them, didn't I? I opened my mouth, then closed it. She had a point. With a cool, dusky wind circling the courtyard, we set the final beam in place. Flor dusted off her hands and came forward until our legs were almost touching. What is it you really want, Everson? I didn't realize I had been bracing my ribs on the right side until her hand slid under my sweat-damp shirt and over the ache. For someone who behaved with such dispassion in the face of danger, her palm blazed with heat. My body stiffened, then molded against her touch. I work for collectors, she said with a sigh. A group with an interest in ancient texts and artifacts. Like a museum? I asked, struggling to keep her face in focus. God, she felt good. No, they are private collectors. Her palm shifted to another sore spot. They read the same article as you, James and Bertrand. They hired me to see if the texts were here and to keep anyone from taking them. I fought for a little analytical distance. Her secrecy, her military-grade rifle, her composure, and, yes, her terminal good looks. They all seemed consistent with someone who contracted out her services to the highest bidders, which explained why she had been so concerned about Bertrand arriving here first. "Were you supposed to take the texts?" I asked, pointedly. I was only to keep them safe until the group could negotiate with the Romanian government for their purchase. Purchase? Given their rarity, the texts would have cost a fortune. Who is this group? I am paid to do a job, not ask questions. She pressed closer. Are you happy now? Almost. I leaned toward her lips, a man anticipating his first taste of water after a 6-month drought. I half expected a recoil and sharp slap. But Flora's eyelids softened. Her chin tilted upward. Well, I dare say the wolves will have a devil of a time getting through that. Flora and I jerked apart. A moment later, James appeared along the walkway, a pickaxe slung over one shoulder. Awesome timing, mate. He arrived beside us and looked the barricade up and down, nodding his approval. But when he turned to face us, his eyes were absent their usual joviality. Everything all right? I asked. He seemed to will his mouth into a smile. Couldn't be better, mate. He clapped my shoulder with a little too much enthusiasm. Hard work breaking up those gargoyles, but it's done. Great. He had seen our near kiss, and now he was jealous. As if there wasn't already enough tension among the 4 of us. Where is Bertrand? Flora asked. We all peered around. A moment later, the Frenchman appeared at the far end of the courtyard. He had done away with his crutches and was limp-hopping toward us, a sweaty sweep of hair dangling over his eyes. Where are they? He demanded. Where are the texts? We told you, James said. The library and vault were empty when we arrived. That is a lie. He arrived in front of us, the muscles around his eyes trembling with anger. You took them. He pointed at Flor, but swept his arm back and forth to implicate all of us. I stepped forward. You need to calm down, bud. No one took anything. But they are here, he said. I can feel them. Flor waved a dismissive hand. You are crazy. His eyes jerked around until they locked on our packs, which we'd set beside a pillar. He hopped over and began tugging at the zippers of Flor's pack. We will see who is crazy. James seized the scruff of his jacket. It's not polite to root through other people's belongings, mate. Bertrand flailed his arms around, catching James in the mouth. James recoiled, the back of a hand to his lower lip, then held out both fists in a classic boxer stance. Before I could intervene, Flor was behind Bertrand, a black pistol jammed against the back of his head. Let go of my pack. I rushed up, palms showing. Hey, let's all just take a few deep breaths here. Bertrand, put her pack down. From his stooped-over position, Bertrand grunted and released the pack. Okay, now, Flor, let's put the gun away, shall we? Her lip curled, but she stepped back, clicking on the safety and holstering the pistol in the back of her pants. I lowered my hands carefully, as though any sudden movement could shatter the fragile peace. I am not sharing my food with him, Flor declared. Neither am I. James glared down at Bertrand. The mad bastard bloodied my lip. I do not want the food of rogues, Bertrand spat back. It will probably be poisoned. Guys, look, I said. Like it or not, we're stuck with one another until we make it back to the village. We're going to have to figure out a way to get along. I mean, it would be a shame to have survived the wolves and gargoyles only to end up killing each other. I chuckled at my own joke, but no one else joined in. But I know you have the texts, Bertrand said to us through clenched teeth. Here, Flor snapped. She unzipped her pack and, its mouth open for all to see, shuffled her hand around the contents. Wads of clothes, a gas stove, metallic packets of food. There, do you see? No text, you crazy man. Bertrand's lips pressed together. To further dispel the tension, I opened my pack, too. While doing my own digging, my fingers encountered something cold and metallic. I withdrew a cone-shaped bullet, one that must have punctured my pack when Flor was shooting downstairs. I held it up in front of my face. Was that silver? Flor's hand closed around it. I am sorry about that. What about his pack? Bertrand asked, cutting his eyes to James. Sorry, mate, but you don't get anything from me by throwing tantrums. Flor sighed at the absurdity of what Bertrand was asking. Do you think I would have let James take anything? Besides, I already checked. James stared at her. You did what? Bertrand pulled at his chin, no doubt recalling the sensation of a pistol against the back of his head. At last, he gave a single nod. Fine. He straightened and tugged his jacket straight. But that does not change the fact that the texts are here. We will continue our search in the morning. With that, he limped off to a prayer cell he'd apparently claimed for his quarters. Did he say we? James asked, glancing at the blood on the back of his hand. His bottom lip was beginning to pouch out where Bertrand had struck him. Since when are we a team? I snorted. Since he realized we're his best chance of finding whatever he's looking for. Flor hoisted her pack onto his shoulder and hefted her titanium case. If he wants to stay, it is his funeral. I am leaving in the morning. Right. Well, you can count me in, James said. I felt their gazes cut to me, but my own eyes were on the flickering light in the doorway Bertrand had disappeared through. They are here. I can feel them. The Frenchman had looked fit for a Parisian asylum, and yet I felt something too. The feeling was hard to explain. An insistent tapping at the base of my skull, an electric tingling over the hairs of my body. But what I sought was here, resonating with some part of me. Beckoning. Everson? Flor said. I blinked from Bertrand's flickering doorway to the cold reason in Flor's eyes. I hesitated slightly before nodding. Yeah. I'll go in the morning too. Chapter 12. I zipped my jacket to my throat as I scuffed a slow patrol around the courtyard. James, Flor, and I had split the night into 3 shifts, as much to keep tabs on Bertrand as the monastery, and I had the midnight to 3 a.m. Except for the whistle of cold wind, Dolhaska was silent. No wolves at the door, no gargoyles in the library. As I walked, my thoughts drifted like the membranes of mist wrapping the stone pillars. I wondered about the pull of the monastery, about my conviction that the texts were here somewhere. And that energy in the vault. The last time I had felt anything like it had been in Grandpa's study. Grandpa had never talked about that night again. In fact, scarcely a week after he sliced, and then apparently healed, my finger, the old East Manhattan townhouse he had owned for decades went on the market. A month later, we moved into a house in a boring suburb on Long Island. Nana explained that Grandpa wanted to slow down, to cut back on his work. We're both getting a little too old for the bustling city, she said. And the schools are better out here. Grandpa did seem to be home more, and I noticed early on that he left the door to his new study unlocked, often open. But it was a plain study, without a mysterious trunk or even bookcases. Just a desk with a typewriter, surrounded by a few metal filing cabinets. I never heard chanting or chilling voices from that study. Never experienced any strange energies. Gone, too, was much of the fascination and fear I used to feel in the man's presence. Maybe I was just growing up. The summer before I left for college, I came home from a date one night around midnight. I snapped on the living room light, surprised to find Grandpa in the easy chair beside the front window, wearing one of his dark linen suits, long legs crossed. He had never waited up for me before, but I didn't get that that was what he was doing. He blinked sedately in the sudden light. "Oh, hey," I said. He nodded and said quietly, "Efferson?" He brought his far hand from the side of the chair to his lap, and I saw he was palming a snifter of cognac. He swirled it gently, then took a sip. I had never known him to drink. "Well, I'm gonna head up to bed," I said. I had just reached the staircase when he spoke through his thick accent. "You are intent on returning to the city?" I twisted to face him. "Huh?" He so rarely remarked on my life, it took a moment to process his words. I mean, yeah, Midtown College is one of the few with advanced programs in mythology studies, and I'll be on scholarship, which will offset the cost of— "You like the myths?" He interrupted. "Well, myths, iconography, symbols, ritual practices, yeah." "Why is that?" Grandpa had always seemed distant, but it was the distance of one whose mind was other places. Maybe it was the tilt of his head now, but something looked different about him, as though he were more fully inside himself. I released the banister and took a step toward him. "Because mythology speaks to something deeper," I said. "Something not quite seen, like a huge ocean beneath a thin mantle." I watched Grandpa regarding me, a tuning fork-like resonance seeming to ring between our eyes. And was that a small smile on his lips? "Sometimes I feel that if I could, I don't know, learn the language of myth, I could access that place." Grandpa's chuckle sounded hollow and knowing. He set the snifter on an end table, beside an old framed photo of his daughter, my mother, and beckoned with a pair of fingers. "Come here, Efferson." As I drew nearer, he held up both hands, palms showing, then moved one hand over the back of the other in an elegant gesture. When he showed me his palms again, a necklace and round pendant were in his right one. I laughed. "How did you do that?" He brought a slender finger to his lips. "You will wake Nana." But he was chuckling softly. "It is a simple sleight of hand." He released the necklace, allowing it to slide into the sleeve of his suit, then repeated the trick, slowly. I peeked at his eyes, which seemed to glow with some memory. When his right hand circled the back of his left, his elbow flicked up so his sleeve deposited the necklace back into his palm. But the motion was so smooth, the timing so exact, I almost missed it. He held the necklace out. "Here, it is for you." I was surprised at its weight in my hand, the pendant a large coin. "Iron," Grandpa said. I studied the coin's symmetrical pattern. A circle with two squares inside, one rotated like a diamond, intersecting lines, smaller marks on the corners. It looked like some sort of alchemy symbol, and whether or not it was my imagination, a force seemed to pulse from the cold metal. "The necklace is an heirloom," Grandpa said. "It is meant to protect." "Thank you." I glanced at his serious face. "But protect against what?" Grandpa took the necklace by the chain and placed it around my neck, the coin settling over my sternum. As the subtle pulse from the metal radiated through bone, I wasn't imagining it now. The force became something deep and tidal, making me feel larger. Grandpa looked me over and nodded, as though approving the fit of a suit. "Wear it in the city, under your shirt." He wasn't asking. "And be very careful the words you speak." I returned from the memory, one hand touching the place on my chest where the coin hung. My headlamp illuminated a curving wall with deep stone shelves. The atmosphere tingled with energy. I blinked twice. The hell? I had been walking as I reminisced, yes, and I vaguely remembered having made my way down some steps. But I rotated slowly, my chest tightening at the idea. I had come all the way to the vault of forbidden texts. My heart leapt into panic. The curse of Dolhaska had led me here. I was sure of it. I was wheeling to rush back up the steps, to fresh air and space and safety, when I recognized the energy of the room. The night I had broken into Grandpa's old study, I had felt it near the bookcases, the same bookcases whose titles had changed when Grandpa spoke that word, Svelare. The thought of it seemed to send a small shudder around the room, and I could have sworn something fluttered on the verge of my vision, deep in the bookshelves. Gone now, but it had looked as though something was trying to take form. I drew in my breath, hesitated on Grandpa's warning. "Be very careful the words you speak," and released the word. Svelare. The syllables vibrated from my mouth, establishing a kind of tonal resonance in the vault. Deep in the shelves, oscillations. I blinked twice and shone my headlamp around. A second ago, the shelves had been empty. Now they were crowded with leather-bound books. Shut the fuck up. I reached toward and pulled one from its slot, the dark leather cover extraordinarily well preserved. I opened it to the first handwritten page, stunning calligraphy in Old Latin. Translated, it read, "Gospel of the Egyptians," an early Christian text, believed lost. "I don't believe this," I whispered. Behind me, something scuffed over stone. I wheeled, a shout lodged in my throat. Expecting gargoyles, I was startled to find a flash of lenses. But the lenses weren't aimed at me. They stared around the vault. "They are here," Bertrand marveled, removing his glasses as he emerged from the staircase. "By God, they are here!" Chapter 13. Bertrand shoved past me and pulled down a book, his lighter flickering over the pages. "Oh my, a Sappho," he said, "composed hundreds of years before Christ." He seemed to be speaking more to himself than to me. "And this." He pulled and opened a second book. "Ha ha! Yes, this is an old Persian prayer book, translated into a liturgical Latin, the only one of its kind." I looked from Bertrand to the books, stunned by the sudden appearance of both. Bertrand must have slipped from his room and followed me. I returned the book I had pulled and scanned the others. The Book of Souls would be among them, and something told me I needed to find it before Bertrand did. "It is a treasure," Bertrand said of the collection. "A treasure!" I was reaching for another book when he seized my wrist. He pulled himself close until I could smell his sour sweat. In a thick, whispered voice, he said, "We must not tell the others." "You want to keep this from them?" I asked. "Besides being impossible, we agreed to share our findings." "You agreed to share, not me." I yanked my arm from his grasp. "I don't give a damn what you did or didn't agree to. We'd both be decomposing right now if Fleur and James hadn't saved us from the wolves and gargoyles." He looked from me to the books, shadows climbing over his bony face. "Fine. We tell them, but not tonight. Not until we catalogue the collection." Before I could answer, he shed his pack and began digging through it. When he straightened, he was holding 2 notepads and a pair of pens. He pushed one of each into my hands. "You begin on that side. I will start over here. Then we check each other's work. Ensure there are no omissions. Whether the man was a phony or not, Bertrand had proven his proficiency in Old Greek and Latin, as well as in ancient texts. And his proposal held merit. By working through the night, we could complete a catalog by the morning, one the four of us could work from for the next several days. Plus, it would prevent anyone, including Bertrand, from making off with a text. I nodded, my phobia returning to sit on my chest. All right. My list grew faster than Bertrand's, mostly because he was stopping to peruse the texts, while I was on a mission to find a single book. I hid this fact by working through the collection systematically. 2 hours before dawn, eyes dry and strained, fingertips chafed, I pulled down a thick tome. Even before peering on the black leather cover, its weight spoke to me. A symbol, similar to that on my coin pendant, had been burned into the leather. On the first page, large letters confirmed my growing certainty. Liber de Animis. Like a child, I sat cross-legged with the book, the rest of the vault seeming to draw back as though on tracks. Breathless, I read the first line. Herein lie the grimoires sacred to the line of Michael, defender of souls. I raised my gaze to Bertrand, who was absorbed in his own book. Holding him there, I slid the Book of Souls into a sleeve in the back of my pack, where the internal frame had been. I covered the opening with a sweatshirt, then stood and pulled another book from the shelf. When Bertrand and I switched pads an hour later, he looked over my list and smiled companionably. Oh, the knowledge that will come from these works, Everson. It will alter the trajectory of scholarship, open new avenues of thought. He squinted up the steps. I am glad it was you who found them and not the others. Oh, yeah? You are green, but at least you are an academic. Well, James, too, I pointed out. At Oxford. Bertrand sniffed. So he claims. What do you mean? I asked him about a professor in his department. He talked like he knew him, but I could tell by his face he did not. I thought about that. Fleur had said his story checked out. Then again, she had also said Bertrand was a fraud, and yet here he was, displaying an interest and understanding of the texts that went far beyond a layman's. As though picking up on my thoughts, Bertrand sniffed again. I do not trust the Spaniard either. I believe she means to steal these. We must watch them closely, Everson. Even a single missing text will compromise what might be gained here. The works must be studied as a whole. I nodded, then lifted my pack with the hidden book and turned it so the sleeve was against the wall. But where did they come from? James asked, looking from the texts to Bertrand and me. They weren't here yesterday. How's this possible? How are gargoyles coming to life possible? I replied, bristling at the suspicion in James's voice. Hell if I know. 1 minute the shelves were empty, and then they were full. In any case, Bertrand and I cataloged the collection and made lists. I handed one each to James and Fleur. Why didn't you wake us? Fleur asked, her eyes moving down the entries. I searched for an answer that wouldn't sound defensive or patronizing, but before I could speak, Bertrand spat, Because in the confusion you would have stolen what you wanted. How do we know you didn't do the same? Fleur shot back. Guys, come on, I said. We checked each other's work. Standing so that my legs blocked my pack, I clapped my hands, anxious to change the subject. All right. There are a lot of books, but not a lot of time. So here are the ground rules. Find the ones you're interested in. They can be checked out 2 at a time and taken anywhere in the monastery. But they must be returned by the next morning to give someone else a chance to read them. Are we all agreed? Seeing nothing objectionable in that, James and Fleur nodded. I chose 2 books. One because it contained a legend that went into the origins of a Saint Michael, possibly the one referenced in the Book of Souls. I signed out the second for no other reason than that it was the approximate size and weight of the stolen tome in my bag. I left the others to their selections, climbing back up to the prayer cell where I had slept the first part of last night. There I sat in a shadowy corner, facing the door. After listening to ensure no one was coming, I pulled the Book of Souls from my backpack and shoved the other one into its place. Energy hummed over the book's binding, like a life force. The same force that had pulled me back to the vault last night. I opened the cover and began to read. Chapter 14. The sound of crying pulled me from my reading. I looked up from my book, half startled, to find a room around me. So completely had I fallen into the book's mind-bending world of prisms and power lines, spells and symbols, summonings and supernatural beings. Grandpa's world. Mystifying and yet oddly familiar. Was this what Grandpa had been getting at 10 years ago when he spoke of those of our blood? The only clues to his mysterious existence were the things I had observed from his closet when I was 13, and the few odd items I found rummaging around the house after his death. A death that lacked the mystery of his life. He was struck by a car while crossing a street near our house, a no-fault case of him stepping from between two parked SUVs at the very moment a bee flew into the face of an oncoming driver. The distressed woman, on her way to pick up her son from nursery school, had the welt and stinger to prove it. Just one of those things. Among the items I found was Grandpa's cane, his ring with the dragon, and rolled up among some maps in the back of his closet, an old poster advertising Asmus the Great, Master Magician. The poster depicted a tuxedo-clad man with rosy cheeks reaching into a top hat. He looked like a younger version of Grandpa. Remembering the sleight of hand trick Grandpa had taught me, I wondered if he'd done a stint with Barnum's American Museum, the advertised venue. There had been a Barnum's Museum in the city, I would later learn. The only problem was that it had burned to the ground in 1868. Had Grandpa's grandpa been the stage magician? There was no one around to ask. A month after Grandpa's death, Nana succumbed to pneumonia, though I always suspected heartbreak to have played its part. The muffled crying started up again. I hid the book in my pack, swapping it for the one I'd checked out, and consulted my watch. More than 10 hours had passed since I'd begun reading. Outside my room, the gray light of dusk fell onto the courtyard. I had been dimly aware of the others coming and going throughout the day, no doubt relaying texts to and from the vault. Across the open space, the light of a small fire danced from Bertrand's room, and I could hear his muttering voice. But the crying was coming from the room beside mine. I craned my neck through the doorway, surprised to find Fleur face down on her bedding in the corner of the dormitory, hair splayed over the forearm she was sobbing against. "Hey," I said softly. "Everything all right?" She sniffled and wiped her eyes with her sleeping bag. Papers were strewn around her, as though thrown in frustration. "No," she said. "Everything is awful." Though Bertrand's warning about her lingered in my mind, she sounded more fragile than I had ever heard her. I hadn't even thought fragility a part of her makeup. I lowered myself to the edge of her sleeping pad. "Well, if you tell me what's going on, maybe I can help." With a long sniff, Fleur sat up and tucked her hair behind her ears. She glanced up at me with damp, red-rimmed eyes. She hadn't been acting, then began gathering the strewn papers. "This is the list I was given by the collectors," she said. "The texts I was supposed to make sure were here, but except for a few, the names on their list do not match the names on the one you gave me." "May I?" I asked. When she handed me the lists, I looked them over. "Ah, the names the collectors gave you are in Orthodox Latin. Understandable, but the titles of the texts are in a Latin used by the monks, some of the words entirely different. So, let's see." I pulled a pen from my shirt pocket as I consulted both lists. This matches here. I wrote a small letter A beside both titles. And this one matches this. Beside those, I penned a B. Flor watched me work, her body gradually conforming to the side of mine. Not an unpleasant feeling. I continued until I had accounted for all of the titles on the list she had brought with her. All save one. You see? I smiled over at her. Nothing to be upset about. What about this one? She asked, indicating the Book of Souls. It's not here, apparently. Her glistening gaze searched my eyes before falling to my lips. In the next moment, her mouth was against mine, fingers sliding into my hair. I leaned into the kiss, dizzy with her aggression, her strong, sensual taste. She broke back suddenly, hands holding the sides of my head. I have wanted this since I met you. I nodded dazedly, falling into her lips again. She pulled me on top of her, fingers unclasping the buttons of my shirt. I held her cheeks, her neck, squeezed the muscles of her upper back. You were right, love, a voice said. I sat up and twisted around to find James standing inside the doorway, a hard gleam in his eyes. As I buttoned my shirt back, I heard Flor scoot off the bedding behind me. With the shock of intrusion, I hadn't paid attention to James's actual words. Ever heard of knocking? I muttered. Is that it? Flor asked. When James stepped into the light, I saw he was holding the Book of Souls. I imagine so, he said. Everson had it stuffed in his pack. He can verify it, though. I looked from James to Flor, who was standing now, and pointing her pistol at me. Is that the missing book? She asked. Her hair was mussed from our 2 minutes of heaven, but her voice was ice cold. I stammered silently for a second, my lips still throbbing. What in the hell is going on? I am sorry, Everson, she said. We were hired to do a job. We? My eyes flicked between them, head spinning with the unreality of what was happening. You're working together? James gave a hard smile as he paced around me to Flor. Pulling her to his side, he kissed her crown with the familiarity of a lover. As I said, 2 heads are better than 1. Is it the missing book? Flor repeated. Get him to tell you, I said bitterly. James speaks old Lat. I stopped, remembering how he had found the inscription outside the vault of forbidden texts, but not actually translated it. You don't, do you? You just know that one line you fed me at the pension. The manuscripts are said to be in archaic Latin. New, James corrected me. I've already forgotten it. I sighed. Who knew how long they'd been hanging out in the village, waiting for an unwitting researcher to show up and act as their translator, to help ensure they would locate the correct texts. They had no doubt tried Bertrand, who rightly saw them as trouble, hence their need to impugn his character. Everson Croft, on the other hand, classic dupe. I fell for the whole damned thing, from Flor's pretended reluctance to travel together, to her supposed Google search, to her hot damsel-in-distress act. My gaze moved across the papers I had notated for her. I believe Flor asked you a question, James said. Is this the missing book? I looked from the bore of Flor's pistol to the tome in James's hand. I remembered what I had felt while reading it, the shifting deep inside me, like wooden boxes being pushed from a trapdoor, one that opened onto the same subterranean ocean I had described to Grandpa. The book didn't belong to them, and I sensed the powerful book felt the same way. What are you going to do with it? I asked. James chuckled. I'll take that as a yes. He flipped open the book and thumbed through the pages irreverently. We'll be taking it, of course. Taking them all, in fact. We have very wealthy collectors in the wings. Flor wasn't lying about that. Just about them wanting to purchase the collection from the Romanian government. Would you consider leaving that one? Heavens, no. James snapped closed the book and tucked it under an arm. "It's the one the collectors are most interested in." Heat burned in my cheeks. "So what now?" "We have to send you and Bertrand out, I'm afraid," James said. "Feed us to the wolves?" I said numbly. "Messy for you, but rather tidy for us." Fleur huffed. "You two are talking too much. The alternative is I shoot you." "How sweet," I muttered. James set the Book of Souls down and lifted Fleur's rifle. It was no accident she was carrying silver ammo, or that James had packed rock-salt necklaces. This was their work, looting ancient sites, some of them cursed, no doubt. "Let's go," James said. "We'll pick up Bertrand on the way." "Can I grab my backpack at least?" "No." Fleur jabbed me in the side with the pistol, sending a spear through one of the spots she'd soothed last night. "Move your ass." I stumbled into the courtyard. I considered running, but there was nowhere to run. Doing so would just get me shot. Bertrand's and my best chance would be to do as they said and then, once outside, scale a tree and wait until morning, attempt the journey down to the village then. It seemed a reasonable plan, until I remembered the bear-like paws on the wolves. Something told me they would use them to climb after us. We arrived at Bertrand's room and found him sitting in a corner, scribbling into the notepad on his propped-up knees. His hair jerked as he consulted open texts on either side of him. "Check-out time," James called. Bertrand's face shot up, his eyes seeming to refocus from some distant realm. He swept his hair to one side and squinted at the pointed weapons, which glinted in the light of his small fire. "What is the meaning of this?" "You were right," I told him. "They're a couple of scoundrels. They're going to send us out to the wolves and take the books to some collector so they can buy themselves iPods and fancy shoes." "Oh, don't be such a poor sport," James said. "If you'd shown yourself a little more agreeable to our line of work, why, we might have asked you to join us. We're in need of a new translator." I remembered my reaction at dinner in the village when Fleur suggested we split the spoils. Another test. "Why?" I growled. "What happened to your last one?" "We had a disagreement," Fleur said. "Now get moving, both of you." I had expected Bertrand to put up a fight, but he was on his hands and knees gathering his notepads. "Leave them," Fleur ordered. "They will do you no good out there." "Oh, let him have them, love," James whispered. "It'll occupy his hands, and we can get them out of here with less fuss." Bertrand hobbled up beside me, notepads pressed to his chest, eyes shifting wildly. The discovery of the texts had meant everything to him. "They will not get away with this," he spat. "I will be damned if they get away with this." "Keep cool," I whispered. "We'll figure out something once we're outside." He ignored me, shuffling through his notepads as James and Fleur prodded us into the courtyard. The barricaded entrance wasn't entirely barricaded anymore, I saw. Stones had been moved and one of the timber beams set aside for Bertrand and me to squeeze through. The cold wind funneling into the monastery carried the cries of wolves. Not close, but not too distant either. Beside me, Bertrand's grumbling turned to hard mutters. "Stay cool," I repeated distractedly, trying to remember the terrain outside the monastery. If we could find a cave in the rock face, a place to fortify ourselves, we had a slim chance of surviving the night. Bertrand's muttering rose in pitch. "Shut up," Fleur said, which were my thoughts as well. He was going to get us both ventilated. But when I turned, I found that he was no longer muttering for muttering's sake. He was reading from one of his notepads. And I recognized the words. The chant was an incantation meant to summon something dark and powerful, an idea that might have seemed insane to me only a few days ago. "Be careful," I whispered, remembering a warning inside the Book of Souls. Whatever you call up, you're going to have to put back down. But the atmosphere of the monastery was already changing. Something was sucking out the oxygen, making it hard to breathe, and an unpleasant smell was rising. A sickly sweet odor that stuck like barbs in my throat. The odor of whatever Bertrand was summoning, I realized. "The Frenchman first," Fleur said as we arrived at the entranceway. "I cannot stand the sight of him any longer." Bertrand snapped straight, the notepads spilling from his arms. He remained like that, eyes large and staring, until I thought he was having a seizure. I grabbed his rigid left arm and gave it a shake. "Bertrand?" When he turned, I released him and staggered back a step. Blackness had spread over his eyes like spilled ink, and his lips were stretching from his teeth, forming a smile so large it looked agonizing. "You can no longer stand the sight of Bertrand?" he said to Fleur in an alien voice, as though something was humming deep in his throat. "Well, perhaps he can no longer stand the sight of you." His smile unhinged, and a droning black cloud shot from his mouth. Wasps, I realized in horror. Fleur had time to scream before the wasps swarmed her face, smothering her cries. Chapter 15. "Stop that!" James's huge eyes looked from Fleur's collapsed body to Bertrand, or whatever Bertrand had become. Seeming to remember he was holding a rifle, James raised it. "Stop! Get them off her!" Bertrand laughed. "As you wish." He waved a hand, and the hundreds upon hundreds of wasps lifted from Fleur and swarmed James. He screamed and stumbled backwards, rifle shots cracking as though the swarm was a being whose heart he might pierce. I crouched beside Fleur, moving the limp arm from across her face. She looked nothing like the woman of only moments before. Her face had become a disfiguration of red welts, eyes a pair of glistening lines, lips a fruit that had burst in the sun. Oh, God. I lowered her lifeless arm. Above me, Bertrand laughed, the sound a sick buzzing. "You dare insult a wasp demon, mother of the brood, matron of death?" I pressed a forearm to my nose, the cloying smell threatening to choke me. "Help me, Everson!" James shrieked above the thickening swarm. "For God's sake, help me!" He tripped over a section of pillar. As he fell onto his back, the wasps descended over his blondness like a black blanket, muffling his cries. A moment later, his spastic arms collapsed out to his sides, the spent rifle clacking against stone. With most of Bertrand's back to me, I left Fleur's body and began edging toward the monastery entrance. The wasps rose from James and returned to Bertrand, funneling into his mouth. There had clearly been another spellbook in the collection, a dark one that Bertrand had gotten his hands on. I didn't know how possessions worked exactly, didn't know how much of Bertrand remained in his body, but I wasn't planning on sticking around to find out. I was almost to the opening when eyes flashed from the darkness beyond, and a thick, snapping snout lunged into the space. "Damn!" I cried, stumbling backwards. Front legs squeezed through as the wolf wriggled and pushed his head in. More fanged snouts jabbed into the surrounding gaps. I shot a glance back at Bertrand. He was finger-combing the front of his hair, as though cleaning a pair of antennas. My eyes shot around the courtyard. All of the monastery's rooms were doorless. There were no places to shut out the wolves, or Bertrand, and my pepper spray would only keep them at bay for so long. The Book of Souls, I thought. I launched into a run, toward the room where James had left it. Behind me I heard the wolf burst inside with a jagged cry, his thick nails scratching over the stone, gaining speed. But a fresh buzzing was climbing over the sounds of the wolves. "Fly, my beauties," Bertrand said. "Kill them." "Yes, please do."
The human, too.
Crap. I seized the side of the dormitory doorway with one hand and swung myself into Floor's old room. The wolf overshot the door, skittering as he tried to break. I kicked past Floor's bag and titanium case, scooped up the Book of Souls, and pressed my back to the wall. I opened the book and began flipping to the back. Most of the book's spells required something called a casting prism and words of power. But not summonings. A wasp landed on my neck, sending a molten barb through me. I crushed it with my shoulder and turned more pages. Out in the courtyard, sharp cries and yelps went up in the thickening swarm. But the swarm hadn't reached me, or the wolf who had been on my heels. A low growl sounded from the doorway. I glanced up to find the beast stalking toward me, ears twitching in the haze of wasps, impervious to their stings. Something told me this was the alpha. Raising a leg in preparation to kick, I dropped my gaze to the page before me. Thelonious, I boomed, pushing energy into the word, making each syllable count. I didn't know who or what I was invoking, but when the alternative was certain death, there was no time to be choosy. I beseech you for aid, I said in the old Latin. I offer myself as vessel in exchange. Creamy white light fluttered on the verge of my vision, then roared in like a strong surf. I could no longer see the wolf, the wasps, the room, the book in my own hands. Just the frothy light that rolled up in layers, growing thicker. From beneath the roaring light came a slow, throbbing sound, like a bass line. The sound compelling, arousing. I could have been inside a West Village jazz club, men and women grooving and bumping bodies. Yes, came a rich voice. I squinted at where the creamy light seemed to thicken around a large, inchoate form. A Buddha. It was clear, though, that this Buddha was no aesthetic. Sensual forms moved around his corpulent form, attending to his needs, which seemed to include food, drink, other things. Are you Thelonious? I asked. Indeed, he replied with a pleasant bass laugh. He seemed benign, at least. I need your help. Though my heartbeat slammed through my words, I sensed Thelonious had drawn me into some sort of parallel plane, outside space and time. I'd say so. Feminine titters accompanied the spirit's rumbling laughter. But I'm busy at the moment. Look, I'm only 23, I babbled. My life's not perfect, but I'm not ready for it to end. I live in New York, the greatest city on earth. I love my chosen field. I'm the youngest PhD candidate in my department, and just a thesis away from graduating. I'm, a lifelong Mets fan, and they're actually doing well this year. I was really grasping now. But if he rejected my appeal and cast me back, I was a dead man. Simple as that. Thelonious chuckled. Long time since I've been in New York. Are there still dance halls? Oh, man, a ton. And the women? Millions, and they're all beautiful. He made a noise of interest, then heaved himself up, his harem streaming away. And you say you're a young man? He circled me as though in assessment. Learned, enjoys sport. He stopped in front of me. If I help you this once, you'll give yourself as a vessel for all time? I hesitated. And what does that entail, exactly? He rumbled more laughter as something like a hand descended onto my shoulder. Nothing but good times. So we'll be running my body like what, a timeshare? When the itch for city life needs scratching, Thelonious will come calling. Otherwise, my body's my own? 100%. And you won't be doing anything illegal in here, right? He released more rich laughter. Not unless you consider loving and living crimes. As the bass line and creamy lights of his world throbbed through me, I found myself nodding. Maybe an occasional visit by Thelonious would do me good.
Get me out of my studio apartment now and again. Given my paltry social life, it certainly couldn't make things worse. All right, I said, not wanting to think about it too hard. I agree to your terms. In exchange for helping me with the wolves and wasp demon, I pledge myself as your vessel whenever the, itch needs scratching. I probably should have asked for an estimate on how often that would be. Right on, brother. Right on. Thelonious gave me the equivalent of a soul shake, and I was back in the monastery, the Book of Souls open in my hands, one leg raised, and a huge wolf stalking me through a growing fog of wasps. "Kill them all!" Bertrand cried from the courtyard, his voice a phlegmy buzz now, as though he were choking on the wasps he spawned. The ensuing laughter sounded like someone coughing up a lung. I glanced around for my own summoned being, wincing as another wasp stung my brow. Thelonious? Chapter 16. The Book of Souls tumbled from my trembling hands. 3 more stings seared my upper back, spreading like a deep burn. I flailed to slap the wasps away, the motion exciting the wolf. He snarled and charged. I cringed against the wall and kicked out. My heel caught the wolf's jaw, harder than I'd struck anything in my life. Bone crunched, and the 200-pound wolf staggered backwards. He righted himself drunkenly, a rope of pink saliva hanging from his crooked mouth. "That's right," I cried, my fear swelling into anger. "There's more where that came from." "Nice one," a bass voice rumbled. "Thelonious!" Either my body was growing or my share of it becoming smaller as the chuckling spirit eased all the way in. The warm, creamy light from earlier undulated through me, an ecstatic force of strength and fecundity. The swarming wasps wavered and dropped from the aura of intoxicating light. We stepped toward the wolf, wasp husks crunching underfoot. The wolf backed away like a scolded house dog, whimpering and trailing urine. When his haunches hit a wall, he pressed himself to the stone floor. I, or rather Thelonious, laughed and reached down to scratch his ear, the hair surprisingly smooth. The wolf licked our hand before succumbing to his stings. "Incubus!" Out in the courtyard, Bertrand stood in a black storm of wasps, arms open, clothes crawling. "Leave the human to his fate." "What are you prepared to deal for him?" Thelonious asked through my mouth. "Hey," I said, "you and I are already locked into a deal." Ignoring me, Thelonious walked us through the storm, his creamy light swelling, illuminating the courtyard in swimmy waves. Wasps peppered us from all sides, the sound of their bodies dropping to the courtyard like a steady hail. I felt like I was experiencing it from the inside of an armored tank, one I had no control over, and that might eject me at any moment. "I will spare you the agony of feeling him die, Incubus," Bertrand answered. "Now leave him to me." Thelonious shook his head. "Bad deal." He thrust my arms forward, and I watched my hands close around Bertrand's throat. Wasps writhed beneath his skin where I squeezed, his enormous black eyes startled, but more in insult, it seemed, than pain. He opened his mouth, unleashing another torrent of insects. As I tried to wince back, Thelonious only seemed to grow larger and more powerful. "Go back to your own joint." He forced the possessed Frenchman to his knees. Bertrand Buzz shrieked, his arms breaking into more wasps as he beat at our hands. "You're killing the mood here," Thelonious said. In a final explosion of dying wasps, the rest of Bertrand came apart. But something grotesque remained. A huge queen wasp curled at his core. Her sticky wings opened out and vibrated, the sudden wind pushing us back. With an angry scream, the queen rose, as though to escape the monastery through the open-air courtyard, but Thelonious jumped and seized her by a rear leg. "Watch the stinger." I had hardly formed the thought when the stinger skewered my right forearm. I clenched my teeth, but the excruciating pain never came. "The sharper the thorn," Thelonious said, pulling out the stinger and snapping it from the queen's body, "the sweeter the fruit." What? Thelonious tossed the stinger away and dragged the queen to the courtyard floor, flipping her so her wings were pinned beneath her. The queen kicked her legs and rotated her alien head. "Wait, you're not planning on—" With a rumbling purr, Thelonious brought his mouth, our mouth, down to the queen's pincer jaws. "Oh God, you are—" I tried to recoil, to twist my head away, but an instant before our lips closed around the gnashing mandibles, Thelonious stopped and began to draw from her. The queen strained back, but her essence was leaving her, being pulled into Thelonious. Hers was a spiny, spiteful energy, full of poison, but at its center was a single sweet drop, the feminine nectar Thelonious was after. When the queen fell still, Thelonious rolled us off her, contented. "That was all right," he rumbled. "Yeah, for you, maybe." I peeked over at the dead queen. "Is this going to be par for the course?" "Know something, young blood?" he said in a languid voice. "Believe I'm gonna enjoy this partnership." Thelonious's creamy white energy that had seemed so benign and good time a moment before collapsed into something dense and black. I choked as it burrowed deeper into me, like a parasite, affixing itself to my soul with hundreds of piercing hooks. The shock of the binding pitched my mind into an oblivion as pitiless as the being I had just bargained with. Chapter 17. I cracked my eyes open onto a diffusion of pale light. I was peering at the sky above the courtyard, the sun a white smear beyond a wash of gray clouds. I pushed myself up, the places I'd been stung the night before searing, and squinted around. The wasps and demon were gone, as though they'd evaporated into mist, but not their victims. The bodies of a dozen or more large wolves lay stiff and bloated. Near the entrance, I spotted James and Fleur, where they had fallen. I staggered to my feet, recalling all that had happened last night. James and Fleur's deception, Bertrand's summoning, Thelonious. I could feel the incubus spirit now, a dark twining, a stain on my soul. "You are a fool." I wheeled to find a tall man stepping from Fleur's room. Though he was without his peasant hat and no longer spoke in broken English, I recognized him by his battered rubber boots. The cart driver paced into the courtyard, the Book of Souls open in his hands. "I told you the journey would be your death." I didn't like his threatening tone. "Who are you?" I asked, stooping for a rock. He raised his disfigured face from the book. When I drew back the rock in warning, he flicked his fingers and uttered something. An invisible force hit my hand, knocking the rock away. "You are the grandson of Esmis Croft." He appraised me with sober eyes, one of them cloudy from the wolf attack. I rubbed my hand. "You knew him?" "Of course." The dragon ring on his third finger gleamed dully as he closed the book. "He was a member of the Order, a principal in the war against the Inquisition, a grand mage." "A wizard?" The man's statement seemed to affirm something I had known on a cellular level, and it explained so much. There was no time to marvel, though. I sensed danger around the stolid man. He had made the perilous journey through the forest, after all, and just disarmed me with a word and gesture. "Who are you?" I glanced around. "What are you doing here?" "I am called Laszlo. I am a keeper of the books." "Keeper of—" I quickly fit the pieces together. "So you're the one who hid the books in the vault, who set up the spell to animate the gargoyles?" I recalled the battered looters downstairs and stepped back. "Books must be kept from certain hands." He tapped his scarred temple as he strode forward. certain minds. Look, I said, I'll leave here and never come back. Never talk about the texts again. I'll forget everything I saw. I promise. When Laszlo arrived in front of me, I sensed a being who was much older than he appeared. And had he said something about a war against the Inquisition? Could that have been the awful war Nana mentioned? But the Inquisition was centuries ago. My mind seized on the poster in Grandpa's closet, the one advertising Asmus the Great at Barnum's American Museum. The depicted stage magician hadn't been his grandfather. It had been Grandpa himself. "You have read the words," Laszlo said. "You have spoken them, and yet here you stand, while your friends are fallen." His gaze shifted from James to Fleur, then to the pile of clothes that had belonged to Bertrand. "It means you are a magic born, like your grandfather." "What?" "But you are still a fool. You made an accord with an ancient being, one that would have consumed a lesser soul. Such an accord might be tempered with practice, but it can never be unbound. You are marked for all time, Everson Croft." The judgment in his tone made me shudder. "I have contacted those more knowledgeable in such matters. I am waiting to hear from them." "Hear what?" "Whether to train you into our order, or to destroy you." I once wondered what it was like for a man awaiting execution to hear whether a last-minute stay had been granted. Now I knew. It was a hard stone in the pit of my stomach, a prickling nausea, a constant disbelieving. While Laszlo took care of the bodies, I spent the day confined to my prayer cell, organizing my pack, reflecting on my life, and, yes, praying. Praying and wondering. Grandpa must have suspected I was a magic born, as Laszlo put it. But why hadn't he said anything? Or had he? I remembered him placing the necklace with the heavy coin around my neck. "Wear it in the city, under your shirt, and be very careful the words you speak." A warning. But against what? He had given me something else of his, the day before his death, though I hadn't recognized it at the time. The day was Sunday. I had ridden the train in from the city for the weekend. Nana and I attended morning mass at the neighborhood cathedral, one that never seemed to resonate for me in the same way St. Martin's in Manhattan had. Afterwards, when Nana had gone upstairs for her nap, Grandpa called me into his study. "Everson," he said, turning toward me from his desk. His cane was propped across his long knees, the same cane he had carried since as far back as I could remember, whose hidden blade had once bitten my finger. "It seems I am having trouble opening it. Would you try?" A bracing fear seized me, similar to the one I had felt upon being discovered in his closet. I hadn't seen the blade since that night, almost 8 years before, and I wasn't sure I wanted to see it again. "Yeah, sure." "Hold it at the top and middle, like this." I did as Grandpa said, the wood smooth and cool in my uncertain grip. "Now do not think about it," he said. "Just pull." The cane seemed to catch at first. No, clench. It was clenching. But after another moment, the wood warming in my hands, it released, sliding apart in a single smooth stroke. I looked at the handsome sword I held in my right hand and then at the staff in my left. I was surprised at how comforting their weight felt, like they were extensions of my arms. But more than that, they felt empowering. "Very good," Grandpa said, taking them back from me. He slid the sword home again, the two parts he had wanted me to separate slotting along an invisible seam. "It remembers you." Remembers? A flash of him thumbing away my blood and running it along the sword blade came back to me. But before I could ask what he meant, Grandpa turned to his desk, If you'll excuse me, Efferson, I have some things to tie up now. Our final conversation. So little said, and yet maybe that had been the point. I was pulled from the memory by a shadow in the doorway. I turned to find Laszlo's tall form approaching, his pale scars luminescent in the late light. I stood at rigid attention. "I have heard," he said, his voice grave. I almost couldn't form the single syllable. My mouth was so dry. "And?" He stepped all the way into the room. Cold power seemed to warp the air around his hands. My heart beat like a dusty drum, but I refused to cower. Whatever the answer, I sensed he had been right. The journey to Dolhaska had been my death. The old Everson Croft was no more. "As decreed by the Order," Laszlo said, "I am to initiate you into training. Tonight."
Thanks for listening to Book of Souls, the first Prof. Croft prequel novella. Everson's story continues in the second prequel novella, Siren Call, also available on this channel. The link can be found in the description. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please like and comment to let us know. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more free audiobooks set in the Croftverse. Book of Souls was written by Brad Magnarella. Narrated by James Patrick Cronin, a member of SAG-AFTRA. Produced by Blue Nose Audio. Production coordination by Candace Lawrence. Post-production by Michael Straza. Copyright 2016 and 2021 by Brad Magnarella. Production copyright 2021 by Brad Magnarella.